might happen. Trouble is, God don't ever die. Your debt to God just continues on and on and on. Justice demands. Because if God said anything less than that, he would not be holy. And if he's not holy, he's not God. Because he compromised. He cut corners without a proper settlement to make it right. Now, Christ made the settlement for me, see? Christ paid for my sins, so God can say, James Melton sinned, but I'm not going to send him to hell. Well, why not? Because he came to my son and got all those sins washed away. So he becomes a son of God himself. But those who haven't, that's where they're going. That's the only place they can go. Like old Bob Jones Sr. said, well, if there isn't a hell, there ought to be. I agree to that. Some people say there's no such thing as a burning hell. Well, if there's not, there ought to be. I mean, why? He understood that justice demands it. Justice absolutely demands it. Number 3, I know it's true not only because God's Word declares it and justice demands it, but finally, nature displays it. Nature displays it. You said nature displays suffering and torment? Yes, it's everywhere. Look at Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. People that don't believe that God allows suffering and a continual suffering, hardship, pain, agony, that a loving God would not do that. They just don't get around too much, or don't open their eyeballs or something. Romans chapter 8. The Bible's very clear that God not only will allow suffering, but he does right now. It's going on every day, all around you. Just open your eyes and take a look. Look at Romans 8, start at verse 18. Romans 8:18, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time, don't you know people who suffer today? Don't you know people who are going through hard times? I'm not just talking about having trouble paying their bills, man. I'm talking about people in pain. I'm talking about people and hurting so much right now that they're crying. They're tears running down their face because the pain won't go away. Maybe they're in a hospital, maybe they're in a nursing home, maybe they're in a trauma center, maybe they're in a burn center somewhere where they just got burned real bad. They're just in this one country. United States of America is only 290 million people. We got roughly 7 billion in this world. I mean, 290 million is not much compared to 7 billion. Just in this one country, there's probably thousands of people right now hurting in so much pain that they can't hold back tears. And God's letting the whole thing just go right on, just letting it go. Why don't God stop it? Why don't God say, I'm a loving God. I don't let people suffer. He most certainly does. I mean, you're saved. You're a born-again child of God, and you get a bad toothache. Does it automatically go away just because you're saved? You get a bad headache. Does it quit just because you're saved? No. A loving God sits on the throne and watches you suffer. I don't say that irreverently toward God. You know what I'm saying? I'm saying God will allow people to suffer. He lets his own children suffer. There are people that are born into this world, they get saved early in life, and they get some disease, and they never can get rid of it, and they're just plagued with that thing for 40, 50, 60 more years of their life, 70, 80 years, and they die in pain, and the only comfort they get is the day they die, they get to go home and be with the Lord. Their entire life was pain from start to finish. I don't say God likes that, or God gets any special joy out of that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying God is some kind of a cruel tyrant God. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when somebody says a loving God won't allow people to suffer, they just don't know what they're talking about. It happens all the time. It's happening everywhere. Look at it. I reckon the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who has subjected the same in hope, talking about just the creation in general, of course human life, but also animal life. Look at verse 21, because the creature itself shall also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know, look at this verse, we know, Paul just takes for granted that you know this. In fact, if you don't know at least this much, you're really not very learned. We know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. God allows suffering. How many of you have a pair of shoes on that's got some leather in them? How about a leather belt? An animal died for you to have that belt, or those shoes, or that wallet, or that purse. An animal suffered. Where do you think leather comes from? See? God allows suffering. It's everywhere. What we're going to have? We're going to have meat today. An animal suffered so you can have meat. See? I mean, it happens. There it is. I can't prove to you that plants have any nerves and feelings. I don't know about that, but they die. There's death. There's death there. There's death that provides for you because it's sacrificial. See, the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom are continually sacrificing for your pleasure and your benefit. See, whether it's willingly or unwillingly, there's suffering and death in this world. There's horrible suffering in this world. It goes on all the time. The whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. Think of some Christian that's going through temptation, hardship. They don't want to sin against God. They want to live right. They want to be clean. And yet Satan has this particular thing he puts in front of them and tempts them with it. God sits right there and lets the whole thing happen. You take a young man, you know, that used to live kind of wild, reckless life, and he's used to a certain lifestyle, and he gets saved, he gets right with God. He don't want to do that anymore, and yet he's not married. And he's used to having his fun on the weekend. And Satan puts this pretty girl in front of him, this situation, you know, he's tempted. Why don't God just step inside and just thump the devil out of the universe? Say, leave my child alone. He don't do it. God lets him go through the temptation. Now, he said, I provide a way of escape, 1 Corinthians 10:13, but he don't take the temptation away. Why don't he? Isn't that a certain amount of suffering right there? Emotional, spiritual, endurance. You have to endure hardship. Paul says, endure hardness. Why don't God just make it easy? Make it easy on all of us. He said, that'll ruin your character. You need some hardship to make you tough. You need to go through some things. You have to suffer. You have to suffer. I have to suffer. Lost people have to suffer. It's everywhere. It goes on all the time. Suffering is everywhere. There's people right now, this very day, this very hour, this very minute, suffering right now. Hurting right now. There's probably people wishing that God would just take them on home. Probably Christians right now suffering, wishing they could just go on and die and get out of their pain, because they know they're saved. They know the moment they're they're going to be with the Lord, and yet God won't let them die. And you can't figure out, it's not like they're a great evangelist and they're gonna win another 10,000 people to Christ. Might just be some old saint on the hospital bed up there. Probably won't be anybody coming to see her all week. God just lets her lay there and hurt. Why? See, well, Paul said, you know why. He said it's going to be a whole lot better one day. What you got now is nothing compared to what it's going to be. So it's going to all balance out in the end. God knows what he's doing. But one reason why is so that people like you and I can look around and say, you know, if God will let sister so-and-so go through that, and she's one of the godliest women I've ever known in my life, if God will let brother so-and-so go through this and go through that, don't you know he'll take a lost sinner and throw him into hell? Don't you know he'll take a man that rejects Jesus Christ every day of his life? Every time we give him a tract, he throws it down. Every time we pay him a visit, he cusses us out. Every time we invite him to church, you know, he says some bad thing, you know, blankety blank this and that. He won't get right. Don't you know God will take a man like that? See, if nothing else, when you suffer and go through hardship, nothing else, there's probably other reasons for it, but if nothing else, it's at least an object lesson. And that is, God's letting me suffer as an example to other people. Lost people see this, and they ought to stop and realize that if God will let me suffer, he'll most certainly let them suffer when he gets ready to throw them into hell. So it happens all the time. People who say that a loving God would not allow suffering, would not allow that nature of suffering, they just don't know much. They don't look around much, and they don't look back much. They don't look back in history very much. Hasn't been that long since the Nazi Germany killed 6 million Jews. There's a good bit of suffering went on there. You ever seen some of those old films, some of those old pictures, and all the, man, it's just make you sick to talk about it. I won't even go into what it was, but I mean just suffering. I mean just bitter persecution and suffering that they had to go through, and hardship. And Chinese, I mean, people need to study communist China for a little while and see what they did. They had a thing in China called the death of 1,000 cuts. Very simple thing. Nothing high-tech about this. Take a man, strap him in a chair, trying to get him to talk, get him to tell you information about where some other people are hiding out at or something like that, you know. Interrogation. If he won't say anything, cut off one ear. Just let him sit there and scream for a little bit. Ask him a few more questions. You won't answer that question, cut off the bottom lip. Won't answer that question, cut off the nose. Won't answer that question, cut off one finger. And they just go through that step, take their time, Just patient, take their time, one step after another, till the guy finally just sits there in pain and just bleeds to death. What did God do? God interfered, did he? Superman, comes in and saves the day? No, God let the whole thing happen. See? I mean, where's God at in a thing like that? Sitting on the throne. Not like God took a break and the devil done it behind his back. I mean, God watched the whole thing happen. I mean, I've read about some of these martyrs. I've read about Harlan Popov, what he went through in Bulgaria, communist Bulgaria, 13 years. Standing there, they'd make that man stand in front of a perfect white wall, just a white glossy wall. You ever tried to stare at something plain without turning your eyes anywhere for just a long period of time? They'd make that man stand about, I want to say a foot or 2 feet, 18 inches, something like that, from this wall. He couldn't see anything else, just white wall, just stare straight at it. They'd stand behind him with a whip. He'd just stand there. His eyes began to water. He couldn't see. It just, after a while, it just becomes all one, just pain all over his face. He just stood there, and if he tried to blink, if he tried to turn his head, he tried to look down, any movement at all, they hit him with the whip. And they made him stand like that for just day after day after day. And one day, they stepped out of the room for a moment. He said he stepped back and looked and caught his reflection in a glass window or something, and just seen himself. He said he didn't even recognize himself. His leg was so swollen and just bruised and big looking, and it was just pitiful. He said, I didn't know who it was. Didn't look like me at all. That's a Christian preacher. If God will let him go through that, don't you think for a second he won't take a Christ-rejecting sinner and put him in a lake of fire? He most certainly will. He will most certainly do that. Just recently, I mean, I don't know who does what, who did or did not do what, but just recently, I mean, just listen to the news. John Kerry has been going around saying that, he's not saying it much now, but they got him on tape where he said it, that he, in Vietnam, actually took part in torturing other people. He said he did it, including, I won't elaborate too much, but including taking electrical wires and hooking old-fashioned telephone, like you illegally go fishing with, He took those things, with electrodes, hooked them up to human genitals, cranked it up, torturing people. He said that's the kind of stuff that I don't know if he said he did that or he knows that got done, but I think he said he actually took part in some of that stuff too. But don't quote me there, I'm not certain. But I heard him say that he was aware of that stuff going on in Vietnam. And he took part in similar atrocities himself. That's torture. Whether they did it or didn't do it, it's not the point. The point is, if it happened, God let it happen. And I've run into cases if I'm taking, I mean, really, folks, this is real life. Just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean it don't happen. It does happen. And God sees it all. I've run into accounts of them taking rat cages, live rats in the cage, putting it over a man's head, and just letting the rats eat the man's face off. What does God do? Does God stop, that's enough? He just sits right there on his throne and just lets it all take place. A God that will do that is a God that will let a sinner burn in hell.